Fortunately for me, I think I had one of the best hydrogeology teachers in the world, Professor Suvadhan Devarankar, and he was a young PhD supervisor at that time, and I was his first student. So I got all the attention that the first student gets from a young teacher, and in a subject like hydrogeology. The first farmer to drill had got a lot of water because he had drilled into cast limestone. So it was a treasure trove of groundwater. Now all the farmers who came there where the borehole was drilled and when he started pumping. So I asked if they would actually share water from this one single borehole. And why were they so happy? They were distributing sweets. And they said, no, we are not happy because we are going to share water from this borehole. We are happy because now each one of us can put a borehole in our farm. And we are sure it's not going to fail.
Welcome to the Water Data Podcast, where we talk about the science, the stories, and the systems that shape our water future. I'm your host, Veena Srinivasan. Every couple of weeks, we'll chat about how better data and evidence can result in better decision making and ultimately better outcomes for people and the planet. So if you're a student, a researcher, an innovator, a practitioner, or just curious about how we can better manage this precious resource, you've come to the right place. Let's get started. This episode was recorded in November 2025 on the sidelines of a two-day event celebrating the life and work of Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni. The event commemorated his winning the 2025 International Water Prize by the University of Oklahoma. Because the conversation was long and very interesting, we've decided to release it in two parts. This is the first of the two episodes. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni, who needs no introduction to anyone who works in the water sector in India. He's a legend. And in India, Groundwater and Dr. Kulkarni and ACWADAM, which is the organization he founded and led for many, many decades, are synonymous and inseparable. And it's difficult to do justice to the contributions of such a personality. Most recently, Dr. Himanshu Kulkarni was awarded the International Water Prize for the year 2025. We just had a celebration of that yesterday, and it was just an amazing honor to be present and just hear people and colleagues from over 25 years describe just the immense contributions of Himanshu, the scientist and practitioner, but also just the person. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Kulkarni.
Hello, nice to see you, and nice to be on this podcast.
So I'll say one thing about the podcast audience is actually not the typical audience that we encounter in the social sector NGO side. It actually spans academia. Some, of course, are young aspiring water professionals, and a lot of listeners from outside India as well. So keeping in mind that context, because people may not know the entire details of the journey. So I'm going to start with your origins of your work, because one of the things that people said over and over again is how you spent the first 15 years of your life in one village in Maharashtra just understanding basaltic systems. So can you just walk us through that, how that started, and just those first 15 years of what you learned about the basalt systems of Maharashtra?
Thank you, Veena. Thanks for the question. So in some ways, there are three things which drew me to this topic of groundwater. First, a little bit of memory from my childhood. The first well that I saw, the first spring that I saw when I was a child, were etched in my mind. And then I went on to study geology, and then part of my postgraduate geology was taking up the topic of hydrogeology. And fortunately for me, I think I had one of the best hydrogeology teachers in the world who taught me hydrogeology in a somewhat different, non-academic, non-research way as one would have expected. He was, of course, a phenomenal teacher. And he was the one who planted the seed of taking up hydrogeology or groundwater studies as part of my research. I mean, I was not sure if I would even begin a career in groundwater, but certainly the interest in the subject of hydrogeology was catalyzed by, one, a good teacher. Second, in the early 1980s, the late 1970s and the early 1980s, even in the city of Pune, which is supposed to be quite water endowed, we were often encountering water scarcities. And especially when one traveled to the rural hinterland, one could see that in summer there were tankers plying here and there. And so though there was that at the back of one's mind. So that was the second reason. And the third reason was also in terms of what was happening in the larger context of water, the discussions in the larger context of water, but also the fact that hydrogeology seemed to be a slightly more different topic as compared to the more conventional topics in geology like sedimentary petrology or paleontology or stratigraphy. And so these are the three very simple reasons why I took up hydrogeology. And I believe that after my MSc, there was no question on where I wanted to go. So I enrolled for my PhD with Professor Devarankar, who was that teacher I talked about, Professor Suvardhan Devarankar, and he was a young PhD supervisor at that time, and I was his first student. So I got all the attention that the first student gets from a young teacher, and in a subject like hydrogeology, that was very important.
Amazing. And then how did you arrive at your study site and how did that journey happen?
So yes, when I began this study, one of the first things, Devarankar sir, as we used to call all our teachers, that's how we used to call them, the surname and then the sir. So Devarankar sir said to me two things. He said, I want this to be a very detailed, deep study, a technical study, a scientific study. But I also want you to look at the social side of ground. And in some ways, that prompted me to begin this journey of looking at serious scientific work on aquifers, on basalt aquifers, but also looking at the implications of groundwater on farming, on drinking water, on the day-to-day lives of people. What is interesting is in the first few months itself, he took me to one of the experiments that he was involved in at that time, and which is relevant even today. So three well-known hydrogeologists of that time, Dr. R.N. Athavale, who was with National Geophysical Research Institute, Dr. S.D. Limine, who then became a very well-known international hydrogeologist, and Professor Devarankar himself, they were involved in one of the first experiments on artificial recharge in basaltic aquifers in Maharashtra. And they were doing it in a place called Kharad, about 40 kilometers from here, at the office of Gram Gaurav Pratishthan, which was then headed by Mr. Vilasrao Salunkhe, who was involved in the Pani Panchayat movement. And I was a lucky student who was asked to do the hard work, bring in tankers of water, put them inside the borehole, make the measurements, and do the entire analysis under the supervision of these three gentlemen. While we were doing that, Devarankar sir also wanted me to have a conversation with Vilasrao Salunkhe on the Pani Panchayat, which was a very different experiment at that time on the equitable distribution of water. And some of these Pani Panchayats were also groundwater based, so the equitable distribution of groundwater. During those conversations, I was also exposed to what is now called the concept of commons or common pool resources, although I didn't know the semantics of the whole idea. But I was also exposed to the idea that when somebody taps into a well, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's their water. It's coming from somewhere else or under somebody else's lands. And therefore, how do you actually look at water through the questions of, yes, sustainable access, as we call it now, but also through equal, equitable distribution of that water within men? The scientific side of things was really about 3 or 4 questions. They were impermeable rocks that gave rise to aquifers with a lot of variability, heterogeneous aquifers. So one idea was to really explore how permeable these rocks were, what was the distribution of that permeability, what was the degree of anisotropy. In simple terms, what was the degree of variability that you found across these aquifers where people tapped into them? The second one was in terms of how would a typical basalt aquifer behave under different fluxes, whether it was a flux by pumping or long-term fluxes or climate or weathers or weather systems or droughts.
Or recharge in this
Or
case,
recharge.
like
And its implications on uses, especially in rural India at that point in time, or at least in rural Maharashtra. Many of the places east of Pune were dependent entirely on groundwater. So all those implications. So that was more or less the way in which one approached the problem. Devankar sir told me that your research should have long-term implications. So we zeroed down to a village called Pabal, about 60, 70 kilometers northeast of Pune, in a drought-prone area, this region, Western Maharashtra region. And we were able to, and by we I mean one of the first lessons I got under his tutelage, under Devankar sir's tutelage, was he said, we are going to learn things together. I'm not your teacher, I'm not your mentor, I'm not your guide, and you're not my student. We are going to be co-travelers on this journey. We are going to take this journey as a co-learning journey, co-learning experience. And I learn from you, you learn from me, we learn from others. And that's how we explored the Pabal aquifer. We looked at, I did fieldwork, a lot of fieldwork. I surveyed 160 wells, all the wells in that village, did a lot of pumping tests, did a lot of work on how groundwater was used from each well, and of course, the scientific side of things in terms of what methods to use for analyzing pumping test data, water level data, and so on and so forth.
So at that time, the basic concept of basalts being these layered aquifers was known, but the hydrogeological properties was less known. Is that what your starting point was?
Yes, it was, I think, a starting point. The generic side of basalts or these aquifers was something about which things were written about. Like broadly permeabilities, impermeable, permeable. So it was very very qualitative. I think what one was trying to explore was do a deep dive in terms of what's the real distribution of permeabilities across aquifers, or what's the interrelationship between aquifers. So although we started only with the shallow aquifers, I think a lot of the work that I did for my PhD also then transitioned into broader questions. If you look at this stack of aquifers, then or stack of basalts, then how does it constitute aquifers in different terrains? So in slightly mountainous, rugged terrains, flatter areas, plateau areas, and across this region. That's one part of the story. And we were also trying to explore if there is a certain degree of variability in aquifer properties, both in terms of their transmission rates as well as the storage capacities of these aquifers. So transmissivity, storativity, those concerns. So it was a fairly quantified study. And that led to many other things, because one of the other things which we noticed during this journey was there was a very rapid transition that was taking place in this region. And the transition was about two or three things. I mean, in today's semantics, we talk about the water energy food nexus.
Right.
But I studied the water energy food nexus in transition in one place, in one village, on one aquifer between the 1980s till the mid 1990s. And this is something that one could record, not just as a part of one's PhD, but also after the PhD as a postdoc, and then as part of a more sort of focused scientific project that we did with collaborators from the British Geology Survey under a DFID joint collaborative program, where we explored the sustainability of these aquifers based on what I had already done. And the implications of this entire transition vis-a-vis the competition between drinking water supplies and water for livelihoods or agriculture.
So we'll come to the social side in just a minute, but I want to still explore the aquifer thing for a few more minutes. From your later work, it was very clear that overall in Maharashtra, in some places, you have these two types of basalts, but they exist in different configurations. Can you walk us through the understanding of basalt aquifers? Did all of those typologies exist within that one village, or then did some of that understanding come from expanding below? Just walk us through the size and scale of some of these things.
Sure. Again, a very interesting question. And I think, to be honest with you, you stirred up memories. I might go on, but you'll have to stop me if need be. From what I recollect, we decided on this village for two reasons. One is it was typical of many, many villages in the region, which, for which I had actually taken a reconnaissance survey before in the entire river basin, so to say. And we zeroed down to this village because this was in the midstream portion of a fairly large river basin. I wouldn't even call it a watershed. This is part of Whaled River Basin, which is a tributary of the Bhima. And this was in the midstream portions. Now, one of the other aspects was the drought proneness, and also the fact that there was a nice little single aquifer system sitting there, which people were tapping into. The fun was we didn't think about typologies yet. That came later. So the typology of a basalt aquifer system came much later. So we first tried to identify what this whole system was. Typically, a geologist would classify basalts into two or three categories. Either they were simple and compound, or they were, the vesicular amygdaloidal basalts, or the non-vesicular denser compacт basalt. What I realized was there was no point in relating groundwater in these basalt aquifers to the stratigraphic and the volcanological genesis of these systems, because that's how geology looks.
Yeah, they care about where did it come from, what is it doing now?
How did it come? And then in terms of correlations, a geologist will rightly so tend to classify them into certain categories. What we found was something very interesting. We found that the aquifer system was constituted by an upper vesicular amygdaloidal, more inhomogeneous, volcanologically more inhomogeneous, more weathering prone layer, and then underlain by a compacт basalt, which at that time was usually classified as one basalt lava flow. Because you had one red layer on top and then the next red tuff layer below. So we also looked at the geology side of things, and one thing which we came to realize, and I'll keep saying we because my entire journey is about we. and not worked alone. So we came to realize that although these two units are volcanologically separate, they have their own identity, they are hydraulically connected. So the upper part of the compact basalt was more fractured, then there was a dense part, and then grading into the lower part. And the overlying vesicular amygdaloidal basalt part was by and large more inhomogeneous, friable, weathered. It had sheet joints, horizontal joints. The compact basalt had vertical joints. And then there were some regional joint and fracture systems that actually connected these two together. So one of the first things we did was to look at aquifers through a groundwater system lens rather than a typical geological layering lens. And that also led us to other systems later on, looking at the typology of the salt system. But in some ways, this was a research discovery, so to say. And we were then able to look at wells. So across a landscape, sometimes you have the same system, but because of the topography, there are certain wells which will tap only into the upper basalt, vesicular amygdaloidal basalt. There are some that run through the entire thickness of the aquifer. And there are some in the lower reaches where the vesicular amygdaloidal basalt isn't present and only tap that fractured portion of the compact basalt system.
What might be the spatial scale of this? So if you had to say a vesicular basalt layer, which then thins out, would that be, are we talking about like in tens of kilometers or hundreds of kilometers, like for that?
This whole system, if you ask me, is something that we were able to put in an area of about 20 square kilometers, like a small watershed of about 20 square kilometers.
And you would see both of these systems. You would see one where there was vesicular basalt, and then you said thinned out, and then you had the compact.
In a more linear sense, possibly about not more than 10 kilometers, within a distance of about 5 or 6, 7 kilometers, as the crow flies, from the uppermost exposure to the lowermost exposure.
So you use the word anisotropy. I just want to explain it for the audience. That's basically the ratios of the flows of horizontal to vertical. So now what you've said is in the vesicular basalts, essentially the flow is very horizontal.
Yes.
While in the compact basalts, it's much lower, but it's primarily vertical in orientation.
Yes.
So does this mean that essentially when you have these layering, it's like a pipe with some holes in it, where most of the flow is kind of going horizontal, but there's some holes which kind of cause it to leak out? Is that?
It's not necessarily in that typical sense, because sometimes what happens is you have blocky joints in the compact basalt. And that has a very different configuration. It really boils down to how hydraulically continuous the whole system is. But spatially, if you just have a compact basalt, the fractured compact basalt exposed, there's very little lateral continuity. And it all depends on, what you get. So there is lateral continuity, but the lateral flows are very slow.
Even if you had a well, it's not going to really tap much because there's not much to pull at all.
It'll just tap into whatever little storage it has from that percolation.
Right.
But the vesicular amygdaloidal basalt system is dominantly horizontal flow, but a lot of stalks because it's weathered. So in many ways, between the fractures, between the joints, what you have as a vesicular amygdaloidal basalt, if it's highly weathered, it might actually even behave like porous medium. So almost like,
Like
porous sand.
Right.
So you have a very different stock and flow system. And, even in lump senses, one of the outputs from even my PhD research is the ranges of transmissivity and storativity for a single aquifer system at different locations. And those ranges were huge. So we had to really dig deep and go and perform tests again and again to get a sense of where they are. And when we went on to the later stages of this study, especially with the BGS, we found that the ranges were even
Wider than you expect.
wider than expected. Because those were more controlled experiments. We had piezometers and everything was in place at that time. So our first, the hypothesis through the PhD thesis was not proved wrong. It was in fact strengthened as we went sort of deeper and deeper into these aquifers.
Do you have our episodes running in the background? If you're curious about a technical term that we use or an acronym we've forgotten to expand, check out our video episodes on YouTube. We have on-screen explanations that might be useful.
So I want to make a little bit of a detour now. Firstly, it was extremely unusual for an advisor in the 1980s from a geology department to say, look at the social side. I'm sure that itself made him, Devlankar sir, an extremely unusual and, hard-sighted guide. But can you kind of tell us now that you've explained a little bit of the geology, what were you seeing about how farmers were interacting with the aquifer across these different parts of the landscape?
Okay, so again, like I said before, the first 15 years, just one basalt aquifer, one shallow, unconfined basalt aquifer, and all the learning. So for me, let me say straight away that that's still, how do you say, my
Magnum opus.
not magnum opus. People always go back to I go back to the drawing board. So that's my drawing board. I go back to it so often. And there were two reasons for that. One was this entire transition. Let me briefly tell you what that transition was. In Pabal village in 1983, there were 160 wells, dug wells. Many of them were shallow. They were not even fully penetrating the aquifer. In 1995, when I stopped working there were 350 wells, so doubled. All of them were fully penetrating, and even some of them were deeper beyond.
Going to lower vesicular.
Going to the lower vesicular basalt. So, I remember one well which was almost 70 or 80 feet deep. And it had gone into the lower aquifer. But that was just beginning. The second was the rapid transition from all the 160 in 1983 having moats, bullock-driven extraction mechanisms, which was popular in Western Maharashtra. Yeah, in 95, all 330, 340, or 350 had submersible pumps, electric-powered submersible pumps. In between,
and what depth now were they?
Well, they were still,
within 100 feet.
Well, these are all dug wells. So usually they were about anywhere between, say, 12 meters, 15 meters, maximum 20 meters. That too, maybe just a couple that were 20 meters. But they still had submersible pumps. In between, there were diesel-powered pump sets. They were
That was before electricity came.
Before electricity came. Diesel-powered pump sets, centrifugal pumps. So moats, diesel-powered centrifugal pumps in this transition till about 1988, 87, 88 was when rural electrification began in the village. 1995, there were no diesel pumps. Then there was the change in cropping pattern from a combination of fodder, maize, and a little bit of wheat. 95, fodder had virtually gone, maize had virtually gone, and it was dominantly onion and wheat. So, rise in the number of wells, rise in the rate of pumping, rise in the volumes of pumping, and this transition. And people were talking, like you asked me this question. So at that time, I noticed that farmers had to dialogue on two fronts. On the one front, it was about wells and productivities of wells. And on the other hand, they were also confronted with a changing market of crops. And this all, we still keep talking about this. So this transition was something that one was able to take to other areas when we started work. After that, in designing this organization, ACWADAM, as a civil society organization, I traveled a lot all over India. And in the early stages of ACWADAM also, we traveled a lot all over India. We talked to many civil society organizations who were working in rural India, especially with farmers. And we were confronted with similar questions. Questions about understanding aquifers. What is their relevance? What is their relevance to conservation? Because conservation was a big thing at that time. And third, in terms of livelihoods, what's the trade-off between improving livelihoods through extraction, greater extraction of groundwater, and then the reverse implications in terms of what's the limit to this extraction. And this was evolving in multiple ways, in myriad ways across the country, in different parts of the country, and one could experience that. And the commonality of the dialogue was, on the one side, dealing for a farmer to be dealing with sinking a well or drilling a borehole or drilling a tube well, and on the other side, dealing with the market. So how do you come to terms with what you have in terms of water and what you need to really deal with the market?
I wanted you to tell the story of that first well you drilled, because that was a really cool story where you showed a picture and you said, the first well in that village and how everybody clapped, and then...
Well, we didn't drill the well.
You didn't drill the well.
It's a symbolic story because we came across it in at least, if I count, maybe about 5 or 6 locations between 95 and 2005 in that decade, where there were 2 situations. One is where there were existing dug wells and they were running dry. Incidentally, one of the things that I forgot to mention, Veena, was in Pabal village, the consequence of that whole nexus story was about water level drop. So between 1983 and 1995, the post-monsoon water level dropped by 4 meters.
Which you were measuring with your team the entire 15 years.
I mean, for the first 5 years, for the first 5 or 6 years, it was just the 2 of us. There was nobody else. So we were measuring all levels twice a year, all ground. But there were a few wells which we kept measuring even after our studies were complete. So the most productive well in Pabal saw a depletion of 4 meters, long-term depletion post-monsoon groundwater. The summer water level actually had dropped by 8 meters, long-term decline. And this was measured. There were many areas where it got reported. Coming back to the story. So one reason why people drilled was they saw that their wells were running dry. Their dug wells were running dry. Their traditional wells were running dry. And by that time, technology had pushed itself into the rural hinterlands. Like drilling was cheap. It was cheaper to drill a 300 feet borehole than to put a 30 feet dug well. So there was economics behind it. So they were drilling for that reason. There were other regions where there were no dug wells. And the government was pushing in rural electrification for farmers. And that was an incentive for many farmers to drill boreholes.
So there were no dug wells because they were on compact basalt?
No, this was
Outside the basalt region.
We've gone outside. For example, the tribal hinterlands, where many of our partners like Samaj Pragati Sahyog, headed by Professor Mir Shah, were working. And there again, the typology was very different. But in this particular village, they were drilling. The first farmer to drill had got a lot of water because he had drilled into cast limestone. So it was a treasure trove of groundwater. And it was, so initially, I think when he drilled, it was artisan. And then, of course, he put a pump there and started drawing water. Now, all the farmers who came there when the borehole was drilled and when he started pumping, so I asked if they would actually share water from this one single borehole. And why were they so happy? They were distributing sweeps. And they said, no, we are not happy because we are going to share water from this borehole. We are happy because now each one of us can put a borehole in our farm. And we are sure it's not going to fail. So that's how the whole system
started.
worked. And in many of these villages, when we went there after, say, 10 years, from one well, it had gone to 100. In some villages, it had gone to 1,000 boreholes. And they were still encountering water scarcity as much as, except for those interim periods where they enjoyed the benefits, the yields were dropping. So this was actually in the Narmada Valley.
In the Narmada Valley.
This was off the basaltic Marwa Plateau. So Indore is on Marwa Plateau, and this is in the Narmada Valley. All tribal pockets where this organization, Samaj Pragati Sahyog, one of our first partners, actually began working.
There's one question that we still missed, which you still haven't answered. I want to hear that because coming back to your original Pabal village, there were places where there was compact basalt on the top, where people had not, I'm assuming in those places open wells were not productive. Or were there no open wells, or were the open wells already deep enough that they were getting it from the lower?
There were open wells.
Okay.
It's not that the compact basalt was not productive at all.
Okay.
There were open wells. They were getting some yields, but it was enough to support a combination of fodder, maize, and whatever other crop.
So let me understand this though. If you have a dug well, you're pumping once a day. So really what you're pumping out is the volume of the well. You're not really, and then it fills up over the day. So why was it just that it would not fill up again within a day, within 24 hours? Like why is it there should be a difference between vesicular basalt and compact then?
So it's not necessarily a difference between vesicular and compact.
Okay.
Again, we then go back to the typical geological system. If you look at the entire system, even if you have farmers, so there were large portions. There was only a small portion which was only compact basalt. Most of the farmers were in some thickness of both, thickness of the vesicular amygdaloid basalt.
Okay.
Now, I won't go into describing the geology of the details of a vesicular amygdaloid basalt, because one of the things I did was, for every well that I surveyed, about 200, 300 of them, or at least the initial 160, 70, definitely, I knew and I had observed when each of them had pumped to their limit, the zones through which water entered the well. Now, people call them springs. I don't know why they do. Not springs in that sense. I had labeled them as inflow zones. Inflow zones to the well. And except for the upper part, the wells were unlined. So one could observe the depth and the direction from which these major zones, yielding zones in the well, were. So this mapping helped me, but the overall quantification and then the whole characterization of aquifer in different parts, I could put it down into 4 broad categories, which is still relevant to any area that you go, any aquifer system, any area that you go, was when you look at the range of transmissivities and the range of specific yield or storativities, as it is called sometimes, the wells themselves, even for a single aquifer, would fall into 4 categories. The first one was wells which were in that part of the aquifer which was both transmissive and had sufficient storage. So high transmissivity, high storage. At the other end of the spectrum were wells which had relatively poor transmissivity and storage. They had some water, And then there were wells in between, like those that had, there were those that were tapping the aquifer where the transmissivity was high, but the storativity was like there were sheet joints, but between the sheet joints, it was relatively hard, unweathered. So it was only those, it was fracture porous. And then there were others where it was more intergranular, not very well defined sheet joints, slow moving. So sort of low transmissivity because the thickness was not too great, but reasonable amount of storage around that entire area. And each of these wells behaved in a different way. So the one at the lowest end of the spectrum usually were seasonal wells. So farmers usually brought out their best crops in Kharif and just after the Kharif.
So that's why fodder for the second
That
crop.
was fodder. Fodder, of course, was because livestock, there was a lot of livestock at that time. Everyone had fodder. Even the high-yielding wells had fodder. What is interesting is the high-yielding wells is something you can easily imagine what could be happening. The other two are most interesting. There were wells which had high yields, which were producing enormous amount of water during the Rabi season, post monsoon. But their yields would quickly drop, and they would hit rock bottom. Like the yields would really drop, and then no summer crop. And then the fourth category was interesting, where the farmers had to install low capacity pumps on their wells. Just because high capacity pumps couldn't sustain. So their transmissivities were limited and they couldn't sustain those rates of pumping. So, I've tried.
I mean, I can relate to this because in Karnataka, we see this all the time.
Yes. So this category was the most interesting because during the drought of 1985 and then also some shortage in the sort of late, I think 88 it was, we were able to identify these wells with those farmers who were selling water to tankers and who had some, by that time, sugarcane, a little bit of sugarcane crop had also come in. They were irrigating their crops in summer. So, it's this correlation which is important. And I can't now say, talk about the exact ranges. But if I go back, I could even talk about the precise ranges of transmissivity and storativity that allowed us to sort of fathom this whole question on how farmers use their wells and what was a kind of endowment, natural endowment from the single aquifer, variable endowment from the single aquifer that led to these implications.
I mean, we will link the publications in. So I know we can't do justice to the entire thing, but people will be able to go and read it up.
Yeah, sure.
If you find this episode to be valuable, please like the video and check out more episodes of the show. And don't forget to subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel. And if you think someone else, maybe a colleague, a student, a friend, or a fellow water enthusiast, might find this show useful, do share it with them. We hope to reach many more change makers like you.
Himanshu, one more detour. I mean, obviously, people started realizing their wells were drying up. And this was also the late 90s, and when Raligasti and Anagari started talking about watershed development. Can you tell us the whole history of that and its relationship with how groundwater was being part of?
Yes, again, an interesting question, because I think late 1990s, early 2000s was also a period of transition in India, parts of India. Because I think by the mid 1990s, some realization on the groundwater crisis, the emerging groundwater crisis was upon us. Many people were talking about it. Even our Pabal study with the DGS revealed that this is a case of exploitation or over extraction of groundwater. But then the whole watershed movement was building up. at this time. And the watershed movement was also coming from different quarters. One of the reasons we founded ACWADAM was we found that there was a dichotomy of what the academia was doing or exploring through science and the questions that people working or organizations working with at the grassroots with people on water issues, the questions that these people were asking. And one of the moot questions was, how much does a watershed development affect aquifers in different parts of India? The more specific questions were, if you build a check dam in one place, well, in two places, in one place, it leads to recharge of water. Like the wells see an improved groundwater level. In other places, there could be two sets of problems. There's no recharge. The water just evaporates. Or there was a third case, which one of the organizations asked us, that we've made many structures, but here's one structure where water is impounded for a few hours, but it goes if. And we are sure it's not leakage from the dam, from the small check dam. So these were the first type of question we encountered. Second was also the question of, watershed development in one village, in a small watershed, but the benefits accruing to the next watershed or a watershed downstream, which has no connection to this upper watershed. And third is, okay, what are the kinds of structures? So this was happening on one side. On the other side, because I was exposed and we had become friends since then with the Pani Panchayats and Vilasrao Salunkhe, we had many, many discussions. We found that in some ways, the benefits of conservation that were created both through supply side augmentation, like good watershed programs, or through smaller experiments on sharing of water, like the Pani Panchayats. These were actually getting affected by groundwater over extraction. The social sciences concept called free riding on the benefits of conservation by a chosen few or by a few communities, free riding by other individuals. We were actually witnessing both of these phenomena. And at that time also in the sort of early 2000s, we took up many studies, we took up many partnerships, we helped many civil society organizations in their design. But the two interesting studies that we took up, again through international collaboration, and that was again fairly large international exposure for us, was the first one was a project called Community Management of Groundwater Resources in rural India. Again, anchored by the British Geological Survey, but there were multiple partners, multiple locations, multiple international partners, multiple Indian partners, multiple locations on this moot question of what is community management of groundwater resources, how is it happening in different ways, and so on and so forth. The other one was called Augmenting Groundwater Resources by Artificial Recharge, AGRA, again led by DGS, and in some ways a precursor to the concept of managed aquifer recharge. So this exposure also brought us closely through an interdisciplinary scientific lens to these two moot questions. The free riding question on one side and the augmentation question on the other side.
And both were happening, right? In some places, you said you were seeing augmentation. In some places, people who were free riding and the augmentation benefits were getting dispersed, if you want. So actually, I have a very stupid question. Coming from Karnataka, in the age I have grown up in my groundwater journey, groundwater is so overexploited that any water you put in pretty much goes down because there's nothing. It's all all the pore spaces are empty. But some of the work we've done in Maharashtra and the western, in parts of Konkan and so on, Especially when you work with tribal communities at the top of the mountain, the water doesn't stay up there, right? So if it's a vesicular basalt, you're doing recharge and good watershed development work at the top, and let's say you're not even over exploiting it, but the water still doesn't stay till the summer, right? So I was wondering whether, in our case, whether we were framing some of these things wrong. In the sense, suppose I start off with a framing of I'm only doing watershed development for recharge, that's giving me a very limited window into it, versus at the top of the mountain, just slowing of discharge rather than recharge. Is that a fair way to put it, or am I getting this wrong?
I think it's a fair way to put it, but not just basalts. If you look at systems across the entire range, I mean, not so much the alluvial plains, but even if you look at other sort of consolidated sedimentary systems
Like our crystalline basement.
or a crystalline basement in a very rugged terrain, right? Sort of you look at, say, the mountaintop and then the valley below. One of the things you have to remember is your aquifer properties are only going to tell you transmission and storage capacity. The storage property of that, the capacity to store unit volume of water per unit aquifer volume, right? Now, one has to remember that the thickness of the aquifer and the limits of the aquifer,
And the slope also.
let's say a vesicular amygdaloidal basalt right on top of a mountain has limited aerial extent, whereas a similar vesicular amygdaloidal basalt down in the valley will have a larger extent, both exposed and buried.
Right.
So, this is a dimension which we seldom bring into consideration when we combine geology and watershed. And that's one of the reasons why hydrogeology becomes important. Now, coming back to your question, you're right. Like what you do in the upper reaches is really about ensuring that there's longer feed through recharge post-monsoon to the aquifer, which has limited extent. The purpose of managed aquifer recharge for that aquifer is very different.
Correct.
And traditionally, a lot of the communities living there were dependent on springs
Right.
and spring flow. As a matter of fact, even in Pabal, which is a fairly flat area, we had come across springs, but they were not up there. They were actually down in the valley along the main river channel. And they coincided with our discharge areas, the sort of groundwater.
They were feeding into the stream. Yeah.
So I think this dichotomy of people, society, locations is also something that needs to be considered in a watershed program. Because I think, people always talk about recharge and discharge through a very hydrological sense, which is for many decades in India, the classical model of a watershed, whether it was in central India or eastern India or western India, was about the runoff zone, the recharge zone, and the storage zone in a watershed. So this is if your watershed itself, the underlying geology is a homogeneous system, is one single system. But in a layered system, whether it's sedimentary or basalt or whatever, or even crystalline basements, which are likely to have variations, this
Doesn't go
completely wrong. I mean, a single watershed could have 2 or 3 separate systems of aquifers, each with its own unique recharge areas, each with its own storage, and each with its own discharge functions. So I think that uniqueness is something that comes only through the science of hydrogeology.
So, since we are here, let's actually complete the hydrogeology of mountains and springs and everything we've learned from that. And then we'll come to management after that of the entire thing. So, the way I think of your work, a lot of it was in the basalt systems. And then, of course, and that included some of the work in the Narmada Valley and central India and so on. And then you did a lot of work in the Eastern Himalayas. How did that interest in understanding springs, did it come because you originally first saw springs in the Western Ghats and took that, or how did that start? And then what were the insights? What was that journey?
So, again, all of ACWADAM's work has had two drivers behind. One is a very sort of strong scientific legacy in geology, hydrogeology, and the curiosity to explore more of the science. But we didn't want to do it in a typical academic way. We wanted to do it in the living laboratories of nature, as some of our friends call them then. But I think the more important reason why we went where we went was because of a demand for hydrogeology coming from these areas. So one of the things we did at ACWADAM was we instilled through our work a purpose for the subject of hydrogeology and a demand for that. And that is what drove this entire exercise. So even in the Himalayan region, we didn't start in the Eastern Himalayas. We actually started in Uttarakhand with some of our partners who came for a training in watershed management in the central Indian region, telling us that, okay, we've XY organization, we've had our training on watershed management. But the Himalayan system is very different from the central Indian system. We have springs there. And springs are drying. Why don't you come and help us understand the whole system? So that's how the genesis of spring revival started. But there was also a memory from the scientific work in the Western Ghats, even in Pabal, which prompted us to take this up. And, we ourselves were confronted with the Himalayas with one or two fundamental questions, and we were reluctant to go there. Because we considered, as geologists, the Himalayas being one of the most geologically explored regions of India. Those went back to the colonial period and the entire exploration of the geology of the Himalayas. And we had Professor Waldia, who took a class in my MSc. I think it was my junior MSc class for a week. We just had Professor Waldia on Himalayan geology for a week. He was visiting for a week then. And we were confronted with the fact that, what could we do there? But some of our senior trustees, especially Professor Fansalkar and Professor Peshwa, who were also my teachers on geology, they said, no, we must go. We must look at it through the hydrogeological lens. So they came along with me to make sure that I didn't lose my confidence on the geology part. And we explored and we worked with Chirag, which was the first organization that we worked with. And by that time, we had also started a dialogue with People's Science Institute in Dehradun. And Dr. Ravi Chopra also pushed me into working with them on springs. And there were some very interesting questions they asked us, very similar to the watershed questions that, we tried to revive a few springs by creating watershed-like structures just in the upper catchment or in the immediate catchment. But we don't think it's actually revived the spring to its original 100%. So what could be the reason? And as we went on, then the demand came from Sikkim, again, multi-partner effort as part of their climate proofing, climate resilience program, drinking water security program. Government of Sikkim approached both PSI and ACWADAM. And we began with a fundamental question on how does a spring function in the Himalayas? And as we delved deeper, we found that there were three or four scenarios that we encountered. One is in which the recharge area of a springs was immediately at the center, where much of the recharge was happening. The second scenario was in a typical watershed form, so it was at some distance, but either right at the top of the ridge or somewhere in between the spring and the ridge top. But there were many instances where we found that the recharge area was on the antipodal slope from the watershed where the spring was located. So effectively in another watershed. And there was a fourth scenario where we found in Sikkim that recharge to one spring in watershed X was coming from A, B, C, D, P, Q, R watersheds, so multiple recharge zones, natural recharge zones. So this is really what got us started. And then we started correlating, recharge, the spring, the watersheds, and in some crude ways, with the aquifers below. And the connection between these two. So the connection between the landscape, the aquifers below, the watersheds, and springs. And I think that gave rise to the concept of Springshed management.
I think the key component of what you've been able to do is, because as you said, when you yourself went, you felt like, oh, will I be able to contribute?
Yeah.
But what you've really been able to do is to teach hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other people how to do it. And I think a big part of your and ACWADAM's legacy is, I don't know how many thousand people you have now trained on your 15-day course. But at least if you count the number of people who say that they've been inspired, all of this stuff that you learn and that you learn to do it yourself, how are you able to teach people how to do it in a relatively short period of time, such that we now have many organizations which can trace their origin, history, and inspiration back to ACWADAM. So how did that process happen?
To be honest with you, Veena, I wouldn't take any credit for that. Like I said, the demand came from organizations that, can you help us do what you are doing? And this is one of the first steps of demystification. And again, like I said, all my learning, I cannot own anything as my own. It's all come from friends, from teachers, from students, from partners, from people, from grassroots level people, from farmers. So the questions also came from that. So the moot question again here was, okay, can you take the science of hydrogeology? Can you simplify it and help us do what you are doing? Because many of them said, oh, is it that simple? Why weren't we measuring groundwater levels in our wells when we've been doing it all these years? And what do you do with those water level measurements? So I think that demand came from many of these partners. And we also we found substance in the fact that many of them were saying that, can you design a course for our managers, our engineers, our technical people, not so much the grassroots level people to begin with. There was already a very elaborate watershed training program within civil society that was prevalent at that time. And many of these...
The rich to valley concepts were well established.
But also in terms of the larger context of watershed management. And Samaj Prakriti Sahyog again was the first organization to include a 5-day module in their 40-day watershed program. So I would actually give credit to Samaj Prakriti Sahyog for that. We also had a partner here in Pune called Sopecom, who were interested in a similar question, and we were sort of talking to them formally, informally with their staff, with their people. This is the genesis of that whole training. There were more and more people who wanted to get trained. So we started our 15-day foundation course sometime in 2006, and it still is on. And I'm not very good at numbers, so I don't count what I've done. So ACWADAM has some records. I think that would run into hundreds, if not thousands, in terms of the people we have trained as part of our refrigerated. The next step was, could these people then train others in the field? People from villages. In fact, even for our 15-day training program, we kept it very open. We did not have pre-qualifications except for a good understanding of spoken English or Marathi or Hindi. Well, Hindi and English. Because all our 15-day courses are bilingual. We do it through a combination of Hindi and English. And even in the 15-day courses, we got what are called para workers, or people from villages, people from panchayats, who would come and sit in that training, mostly through the partner organizations. So that's what got us started. You know, I'm not a great fan of the word para-engineer or para-hydrogeologist. It sounds to me on a lighter side like paratrooper. I think there's nothing para in science, except for the qualification bit, which people with qualifications are worried about. I think science and knowledge is there to be given, irrespective of what the consequences are, whether you end up with a degree or not. But the philosophical side apart, one big challenge that confronted us was not the medium, the language medium, but the medium of communication. And how do you transfer complex concepts? How do you translate them into good understanding? And I think that gap is filled by what we call demystification. So the way you teach, the language you use, the audio visuals you bring into your teaching, the discussion forums, the informal, formal discussions. So there's a whole bunch of things. And I think this is how the concept of seeding hydrogeology at the grassroots took shape. There are many models to this. Many organizations are doing it in different ways. But I think, again, we believe, and the entire foundation, all the founder trustees in ACWADAM believe that plurality is
necessary.
You know, like I keep listening to these words much later than before the meaning was explained to me. So commons. Commons was a concept that Vilasrao Salunkhe explained to me over many, many weeks during that first phase of my PhD. And this was 83. And the first time I read about the commons was when Eleanor Ostrom brought her book out in 1990. So I'm a very, I'm a very pampered pupil who has been given the meaning before the word comes out. Again, this is on the lighter side, but I think a lot of people are now into training of grassroots people on hydrogeology. I mean, our immediate partners like SPS, PSI, ACT in touch. They have a full-fledged module, in fact. Gram Vikas. And I can name many more. I mean, even in the urban sector, there are many like Biome Trust, Closer Home. I could name 100 organizations.
Right.
A grassroots level hydrogeology training, either a module or a small capsule or a process that is in place. You yourself are doing it.
We are doing some. Yeah.
So, I think it's not, but when we started, it was a challenge. I'm going to take a slight diversion here and also tell you a little bit about the back implications of this entire process of demystification. So by then, one of the other questions we posed ourselves was, if there's a demand for hydrogeology with grassroots level organizations, how do we sustain ourselves? Because we
can't pay.
No, one is a pay. How do we sustain ourselves in terms of not the funding, in terms of getting better hydrogeologists who come and work with us? And the reason
To meet that demand.
to make that but also to train, because conventional academia doesn't churn out the kind of hydrogeologists that we need and we needed. So we went back to the university here, a few colleges here, and we started what is called an internship and dissertation program for students. And a lot of our staff, they started emerging from that internship and that dissertation program. So we still support a lot of formal dissertation. I mean, till a certain point in time, till 2013, I still was guiding scientific PhDs at Pune University. And there were two students who were working under me. But I also realized that their PhD thesis had to be very different from, I mean, mine was different from the more conventional ones that were coming out at that time. So we took it upon ourselves to also look at the, changing the education side slightly. And this then became complementary to each other. These two sides started talking to each other, and we ourselves were in between, so we could bridge that gap to a certain extent. So that's...
And then you subsequently did it, of course, with Shivnadar and TIS and so you basically went upstream to the source of water professionals and kind of almost fixed it there. So that we could create a cadre of people who would then go and people all these other organizations as well.
We didn't do it again. Again, there were catalysts who were watching us, observing us, looking at our work. There was word of mouth going around, and people were interested in our kind. So even academia got interested, some of them. And that's how we made the connection back with the academia, while still keeping our feet entrenched on the ground.
I want to ask one question about all these training programs, which is that, was there an aha moment for you on what concepts people were really struggling with, but then through your process of kind of, constantly improving, you realize that, okay, this is a concept that everybody's struggling with, but this way of teaching it has really kind of helped bridge that, like one or two?
Well, there are many. I mean, I can't really put my finger on one of them. But, there were many aha moments. I mean, from the training point of view, there was one gentleman who came for our training. He came from a village, I think in the Groundwater region of Maharashtra, from one of the partner organizations. And instead of sending, say, a manager, they sent this fairly middle-aged gentleman. And throughout the first 10 days, he didn't speak much. He was very attentive. He used to take notes. He didn't understand English, but Hindi is something he understood. And then Marathi conversations outside. And when we started working on the quantification of groundwater, especially on the concept of a groundwater balance and the practical applications of a groundwater balance, he came alive in class and he started giving the right answers. He was the best in class. So there were moments like this. So he was extremely good at maths and arithmetic. Wasn't a very educated person. He must have been schooled, but he was very hands-on. And for me, that was the aha moment for groundwater balance, because groundwater balance is a concept that I don't think any academic institution in India is teaching.
No.
Correct me if I'm wrong, and I stand to be corrected. There's a lot of teaching that goes around the larger water balance, but specific to groundwater balance. And groundwater balance is something that we progressively learn, but this is something that we picked up during our Pabal project with the British Geological Survey. So I would actually give a lot of that credit to my friends from the BGS who really opened the doors for, might have been a small thing then. But I think we use a lot of that in our work. many of our partners have still not fully assimilated the potential of using a groundwater balance or even doing one. And there are many aspects of this science in our work which we have not published for want of time, because publication also takes time. But we bring them into this whole idea. So one of the scientific implications of a groundwater balance is it has multiple advantages. One is you can get a gross average value of storativity or specificity, which is easy to. We also have a scientific method, a crude method of using the same data to get an average value of transmissivity, which I don't think is published anywhere. At least I have not read about. And we use that sometimes. So that's the scientific side. But that was one aha moment. The other aha moment was from the field. One of our trained volunteers in 2002, 2003, 2004 used to go around measuring water levels in the wells, and who then attended our training. Then, of course, he moved out of the partner organization. He went on to work with another organization. But during a lunch with his family, so he had two houses, one in the valley, one up on the mountain. And we went there for lunch. He was talking to his parents, and his mother took me to a spring close by. And we measured the water in the spring. It was right in their property, in their farm. And this was peak summer, and the spring was yielding at about 15 to 20 liters per minute. So we did some back of the envelope calculations, and I mentioned to his mother, why aren't you using this water? Because they had already invested in a failed dug well on top of the mountain. And subsequently, I didn't realize it was 3 or 4 years later that they started farming in that area. And when we went back for a lunch with them, he said, no, I have to again make sure that my mother has this conversation with you, because it was only after that conversation that we realized that we could use this water. And then, of course, I questioned him, I talked to him. So they were using only a part of that water, because a lot of that spring water would flow down into a small stream and then flow downstream. So he was not even taking the full portion that he could. So these were...
But 4 years later, when you went, farming had begun, the spring was still there, or it has started
It's
drying?
still there even today.
That's it for this episode of the Water Data Podcast. Thank you for listening till the end. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. You can find the Water Data Podcast on all major podcast platforms. Until then, stay curious and stay connected. Thank you.